Just to warn you.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome Mark Patterson here today. Going to be going to talk about the London bee situation and how sustainable beekeeping is in London. So without ruining too much, Mark has been working with the London Beekeepers Association, and he's going to present their findings work and let us know a little bit more about what's going on in London. So over to you, Mark.
All right. Hi, everybody. So yeah, I'm curious to say, so I'm a member of London Beekeepers Association, and I've had some input into their London Bee Situation Report, a small input into it. But my background is I'm an ecologist, nature conservation practitioner, and I'm really interested in bees. I do lots of wild bee recording and things. So I know Kieran from doing Learn to Love Bee and BID courses through the BioLinks project that he worked on. But I'm also a beekeeper. I have a couple of colonies that I keep, and I manage colonies for some clients as well. So I'm sort of I'm a beekeeper category, but I'm also a conservationist, and I'm a sort of ecologist wild bee recorder. I'm going to apologise in advance because you might hear the occasional squeaky dog toy going off in the background because I've got a 16-week-old puppy who's running around playing with his toys. But I'm going to start off by just giving you a bit of history into why London Beekeepers kind of produced this report, the London Bee Situation, and sort of the things that led up to us producing this report and some of the challenges that we had in producing it. So I need to, how do I, right. So the background is for about 10-15 years now, some members of the beekeeping community in London have been kind of questioning, are there too many beehives in parts of London? Is there enough forage for bees? There's been increasing concerns about colony welfare, about disease transmission. We've seen sort of cases of notifiable bee diseases kind of like skyrocket, and London now has sort of more foulbrood cases than any other region in the country. We're kind of the capital for bee diseases. And there's also been some sort of questioning, you know, like if we have got too many bees in parts of the city, and if there isn't enough forage to go around, how is that impacting wild pollinators and, you know, other organisms? At the same time, beekeepers have seen their honey yields, kind of average honey yields, decline somewhat as well. So this is kind of all these concerns is what sort of made us sort of ask this question: do we have too many bees? Do we have enough forage? And we've kind of been suggesting that, you know, we need more forage, and, you know, we need to think about where we're putting hives in the city, and, you know, are there already too many bees in that part of the city? And when we first started kind of voicing these concerns, we were met with quite a bit of opposition. A lot of beekeepers, particularly the commercial beekeepers, felt threatened by what we were suggesting might be happening, and they kind of shot us down. And a few quite high-profile beekeepers kind of, you know, said some pretty awful things about us on radio and on television, you know, suggesting that we were talking bollocks and that, you know, it wasn't true. And we realised that we needed to gather some evidence to actually back up the suggestion that there might be too many bees in parts of the city and insufficient forage in parts of the city to support those colonies. So we set out trying to get together some data, and about 11-12 years ago now, myself, a couple of other people from LBKA, that's the London Beekeepers Association, London Wildlife Trust, GIGGLE, which is Green Space Information for Greater London. They're the Biological Records Centre that hold all the biological records for the Greater London area, and Caroline Birchall from the Bee Collective, who is working with Bug Life on the Beeline for London project. We all met together at London Wildlife Trust's offices, and we kind of discussed how we could generate this data, how we could put it together, because we all had an interest in this. Beekeepers, conservation professionals, you know, invertebrate conservationists. And, you know, I asked the question, you know, if we could get the hive data from the National Bee Unit, or, you know, if the location of all the hives and their distribution across the city, if we could somehow map habitat and forage availability for bees and for pollinators, could we then overlay this data and then work out, you know, which areas are lacking in forage and which areas have high numbers of beehives, and and then we could use that information to target habitat creation projects and influence beekeepers and say to them, think twice about putting bees here, and have a look at the situation instead. So these are the sort of questions we answered. And fortunately, Giggle kind of stood up and said, we've got loads of data. We've got all these parks and green space condition surveys. We know where all of the major park and street trees are in the capital. We know what species they are, what age they are. We could probably work out their nectar production values based on their size and their species and age. So they had a wealth of data, but it was going to take a lot of manpower and time to collate all this data and put it into a format that was usable to us. And it was going to cost quite a bit of money to do this, thousands of pounds to do this. So Caroline Birchall went away and she managed to get some funding to pay for Giggle's time and expertise to kind of collate all of this data. And working alongside researchers from Sussex University, Dr. Karen Alton, they were able to produce some maps showing where the quality foraging habitats are in London. So this is one of the maps they produced, and this shows where the quality foraging habitats are for pollinators in London, and the quality goes from pale pink to dark pink, and the darker pink areas have more quality habitat, foraging habitat, nectar and pollen resources than the paler areas. So this was kind of the starting point for our trying to map forage versus hive distribution in London to try and get a better understanding, better evidence of the sort of bee situation in London. Caroline used this data and used this data to help support the Beeline for London project, which launched earlier this year. Sadly, she never got to see the project launch because she died last year. Unfortunately, she died last May. She's no longer with us. But a lot of the data we have, all this mapping work that we're using, we wouldn't have that if it wasn't for Caroline. So we owe Caroline, a great gratitude, a lot of gratitude for what she did. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us. We then approached the National Bee Unit and said, could we get all your hive information? And because we're interested in hive distribution to compare with these maps. And at first, they were very reluctant to give us the information, and they give us the information at 10 kilometre square resolution, which looks like this. And this really isn't very good for comparing with the habitat data that we had. So we kind of spent a lot of time sort of nagging them to give us the resolution, give us this data, this beekeeper registration, hive registration data at a high resolution, because it just wasn't working for us. We also did a survey of our members to find out where London Beekeepers members keep their beehives, and we produced some heat maps that look like this. And we very quickly realised that there's so many beehives in London. London Beekeeper members are only a small portion of those hives. A lot of the beehives, a lot of the beekeepers in London are not members of London Beekeepers Association. They're either members of home counties associations, which overlap Greater London, or they're not affiliated with any beekeeping association at all. So this was the starting point for producing this is where we started off of trying to produce this London bee situation report. So I'm now just going to switch documents and going to bring up a different presentation. Dogs, be quiet. Shush. Sorry, my dogs are barking because someone's at the door. They're going to have to read right. Shush. Right. So, can you all see my screen still? Yeah. Okay. So this is the report that London Beekeepers produced called the London Beekeeping, the London bee situation, and this is the contents. So there's a bit of introduction, a bit of background, a bit of an explanation as to how we've arrived at the situation we're in London, and then we kind of describe what the situation is, potential issues, and what the association's position is on the situation, what we think we need to be doing to sort of rectify the situation. So for more than 10 years, London has seen an unprecedented rise in beekeeping. This has raised concerns about, like I said, bee welfare, etc., etc. And the report outlines the association's understanding of the situation as a whole based on the existing evidence that we've got available to us. And the association acknowledges that the data isn't perfect. There are lots of caveats with the data. It's not perfect, but it's the best data that is available. And it's the most useful data we have available. There isn't any better data. The number of honeybee colonies in London has more than doubled over the last 10 years, and it continues to rise. It's rising at quite an alarming rate in some locations. It's not even, it's increasing in different paces in different parts of the city. Colony densities varies across the capital. In some parts of the city, we have very high colony densities, and this is raising concerns about animal welfare, sustainability, wildlife conservation, and civil order. And the animal welfare issues are things like, if you have too many bees in one area, they're all competing with each other. Are they going to have enough food to eat? If the colonies are hungry, and we have got evidence that colonies in parts of London are starving. We get reports from beekeepers all the time saying, I've had to feed my bees. Then they're on their knees, they haven't got enough food, they're starving. If bees are hungry, they then go and rob other hives. They bring back disease. This leads to increasing spread of notifiable bee diseases. And as I mentioned earlier, London now has the highest incidences of European foulbrood in the UK. We have, a few years ago, we had over 100 outbreaks in 1 year, which is really, really high. So these are some of the welfare issues that we've got. The issues about sustainability, and wildlife conservation, or if our honeybees are struggling, how are the wild pollinators and other organisms faring that are competing with our colonies? So there's a nature conservation concern as well, and the civil order concern comes around mainly from swarming, but also from aggressive bees. If you have lots and lots of hives in the city, particularly if you have lots of new novice beekeepers who don't understand swarm behaviour and don't understand swarm control and prevention properly, it can lead to a huge surge in the numbers of swarms being put out across the capital. And we've seen this in recent years, that swarms, particularly in the city, the centre of the city, are getting out of hand. And with the congestion charge that ULEZ in parking costs in central London, very few swarm collectors are prepared to go into the centre of the city to collect swarms. And it becomes a really big concern, because if these swarms aren't collected and aren't housed, they become feral. And then that just perpetuates the problem, because feral colonies will swarm and multiply further again. So there's also an issue about, lots of new beekeepers, and they don't understand bee biology very well, they don't understand bee behaviour very well. Their bees can turn nasty. We want to promote keeping of docile bees, because keeping aggressive bees that sting your neighbours is antisocial, and it does cause civil order disputes. So these are the sort of concerns, but the report also wants to acknowledge the positive aspects of urban beekeeping. There's lots of benefits to urban beekeeping. It brings people closer to nature. It gives people a sense of well-being and achievement. It can provide people with local, hyper-local products, as opposed to imported things which are inferior and highly processed and bad for the environment. And it also, there's a lot of community cohesion around beekeeping as well. There's lots of groups get together, to work together around beekeeping. And there's a big social aspect to beekeeping as well. So there are lots of positives to beekeeping, as well as negatives, and we want to kind of acknowledge that in our report. So one of the causes behind this huge surge in beekeeping in London, but not just in London, but elsewhere across the UK and in other big cities around the world, is the Save the Bees narrative. And it's a very confusing narrative. For several decades now, we've had organisations promoting Save the Bees, telling us that bees are in decline, we need to save the bees. But no one's telling us which bees need saving. And a lot of commercial beekeepers and people with a vested interest in honeybees and money to be made from promoting Save the Honeybees have really been pushing the honeybee as the bee that needs to be saving. So if you do Google search for Save the Bees, this is the sort of images that you come across. You find lots of images, predominantly of honeybees, occasionally pictures of hoverflies, because a lot of people who are putting out these adverts don't know the difference between a hoverfly and a bee. They haven't attended my Love Bees course. But this kind of, these sort of images, they kind of, they mainly focus on honeybees, and it's misleading because people then believe it's the honeybees that need saving, And bees are profoundly established in the public imagination. They think there's a lot of public empathy for bees and a lot of general awareness that bees generally are facing problems in the modern world, in decline. But a lot of people don't realize that, this doesn't apply to honeybees. Honeybees are not in decline in the UK, nor globally. In fact, globally, there are over 92 million managed colonies globally, and that's a 60% increase since the 1950s. It's a massive increase. In the UK alone, there's been a 35% increase in registered hive numbers in just the last 3-4 years, so just since before COVID. So, they're not declining. The beekeepers face challenges, and there are challenges through Met, climate change, pesticides, land use change, exotic pests and diseases. But as a species, they're not in decline, they're not threatened. But lots of our other bees and pollinators are. And when people confuse bee declines and the honeybees, it can lead to inappropriate actions or unintended consequences, like investing in more hives, pumping more hives into a small area, where there's reducing limited forage, and then you get all the concerns and problems arising that we've been discussing earlier. Okay, so most of the issues around bee decline are man-made. It's habitat loss, it's degradation, it's fragmentation, it's development pressure. We need land to build new houses. So we're constantly seeing the press, green belt land being used to develop new houses and out-of-town shopping centres. I drove to Northumberland last week for Easter to go do some bee spotting up there. And on the M1, I saw lots of what were once lovely green fields full of pasture land that have now got Amazon warehouses on them, things like this. And all these kind of things is leading to, reduction in habitat and impacting bees. One of the threats that's kind of more new on our radar is climate change, particularly phenological mismatch. We're really starting to notice that now with some of our more specialist pollinators. So just have a quick look at London's green space. So London is a very green city. 47% of London is green space. It's relatively little of this green space includes quality foraging habitat for pollinators. The distribution of quality forage is variable. There's some parts of the city which are very green and leafy, and there are other parts that are very, very built up, like central London, the square mile, where there's very little green space. And most of that green space is on green roofs and things, and green roofs can be good for bees, but they're limited for bees in terms of the height, the wind chill factor, the wind speed gradient, and also you're limited by what can grow on a green roof by the soil depth as well. A lot of green roofs have shallow soil and can't support very extensive vegetation that can produce lots of forage. They can be quite limited. There's a lot of green space loss in London from development pressure. I'm going to go into that a bit more later on. We also have this heat island effect in London, which benefits some bees which like a warmer environment to benefit from a longer foraging season, benefit from the heat island effect. Lots of bees don't. Things like bumblebees really don't like extreme heat. And what we saw last year in London, central London last year, got 40 degrees Celsius in July. Bumblebees just virtually disappeared. They all went underground because it's too hot. And once it gets above 32 Celsius, bumblebees can't regulate metabolism. They actually start to die. So that the heat island effect in the city can be a problem for things like bumblebees. Some of the good points about city and its green spaces are we have less pesticide usage, fewer chemicals. There's a lot less neonics used. Lots of London parks and boroughs, councils are now starting to phase out glyphosate and things which are carcinogenic and remove weedy plants that bees rely on at certain times of the year for forage. So this information, you can get this from London National Park City, Greener, Healthier, Wilder. There's also a publication from Giggle, which is quite old now, it's about 12, 13 years old now, called London Garden City. And that's got some really good facts and figures about London's green space. So overall, London has been 47% green. There are 8.3 million trees, which is 20% of land cover. Sounds a lot, but it's actually quite a bit less than most European cities and American cities. Most European cities have about 24 to 30% tree canopy. Similar sort of figures in the States. So But we have that. I think we have the second highest tree canopy in the UK. I think Manchester is slightly higher. There's over 15,000 local wildlife sites. These are SIG sites, sites of importance for nature conservation. These have some level of protection for their nature conservation value. There are over 30,000 parks. There's an estimated 3.8 million gardens, but only 60% of our gardens are actually green space. 40% of our gardens are concrete or garden sheds or other impermeable surfaces. And increasingly what we're seeing happen at the moment is people replacing their lawns and their planted gardens with fake plastic grass, which is absolutely terrible for pollinators. It doesn't provide any food for pollinators. It also poisons the soil. It's carcinogenic. There's recently been some papers published which have linked plastic grass to brain cancer. So whilst we have lots of gardens, a lot of our gardens, increasingly our gardens are becoming less green. And of the green space in our gardens, very little of it is actually good for pollinators now. I'm just looking at some figures in this London Garden City figure, and it's about, my phone's ringing, I'm just going to mute that phone call. Yeah, it's about 30% of our only about 30% of our oh god, what's happening? My share screen stopped. Sorry about this. Right. Right. Here we go. Sorry, phone call interrupted me. Even though I muted my phone. Yeah, so we've got lots of gardens, but a lot of our gardens on green space. It's paved surfaces, plastic grass, etc., etc. So opportunities to create foraging habitat are limited. Yeah.
Just so you know, we can't see your screen. We can only see you now. We can't see your slides.
Sorry, I got an annoying phone call came in, and it took out my screen.
Yeah, I think it stopped your screen sharing, so you just need to share it again.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's loading up. You just need to bring up the PDF.
Okay. Can you see it now, Kieran?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So as I was saying, we have lots of gardens, lots of green space, but not all of our green space is actually green. A lot of it is increasingly becoming paved. Dog, take your chew over there. You're making too much noise. Sorry about that. Increasingly, our gardens are becoming increasingly paved over, plastic grass, decking, gravel, etc., like that. There's a big issue with people paving over front gardens in particular to create parking space. This is in response to the mayor's increasing parking charges and London local authorities increasing parking charges for street parking, etc. More and more people are paving over their front gardens to provide parking because apparently it adds 20 grand to the cost of your house, the value of your house. So there's lots of challenges when it comes to green space and forage for pollinators in London with our green spaces. So using the Giggle data, this is one of the maps that London Beekeepers have in this report, and this shows quality pollinator foraging habitat. So this is nectar and pollen habitat per square kilometre. So the very pale squares in the very centre, if you look at Westminster and the square mile, you can see that it barely registers as green. It's kind of like a creamy green colour. It barely registers at all. And that's has less than a hectare of quality habitat per square kilometre. So if you're looking at Westminster, Hyde Park barely even registers on that map. And Hyde Park is a big park. It's about 19 hectares, I think, Hyde Park. And that barely registers as quality foraging habitat on that slide because most of Hyde Park is short cut grass and plain trees. And unfortunately, a lot of London parks are like that. If you look a bit further south of Westminster at Wandsworth, you can see Battersea, where Battersea Park is. There's a nice big green square. So Battersea Park is a much better managed for pollinators. There's a lot more native trees, a lot more flowering trees, and fewer plain trees. So in central London in particular, a lot of these big green spaces, whilst they look green, and you might think they're fantastic for pollinators, they're actually quite poor foraging habitat for pollinators because they're mostly shortcut grass with very few flowering plants in them, and the majority of the trees are plain trees which provide neither pollen or nectar. And then on the edge of the city, you have more quality foraging habitat, and the dark green dots are very good, are areas that have very good quality foraging habitat. The one really good bit of quality foraging habitat we have in London is Tower Hamlets 70 Park, which is where I do lots of my bee recording, and you can see that in the Tower Hamlets borough. It's a big dark green spot. So that's a little bit about the forage. And as I said, there tends to be less forage in central London. So this is just an enlarged portion of that map showing central London. So here you have the inner London boroughs. You've got Westminster, Hammersmith and Fulham, Kensington, Chelsea. You've got you've got Westminster. You've got Camden, Islington, Tower Hamlets, the city and Hackney, and in the south of it, you can see you've got Wandsworth, Lambeth, Southwark. So again, is to kind of repeat what I said before. The quality foraging habitat in London, it's not evenly distributed, it's all over the place. And just to go back to development and pressure and habitat loss, we've lost over 3,000 hectares of garden habitat between 1990 and 2007. This is equivalent to 2.5 Hyde Parks, and there's an aerial photograph there of Hyde Park just showing you how big a chunk of green space we've lost in the last sort of decade or so. So we have got some really good foraging habitats, but it's dwindling. And then the report goes on to look at bees and other pollinators in London. So there's high and increasing number of registered beehives in London. We've already said that, but we've also got lots of wild pollinators in London, which also make the city its home. And these range from hoverflies to bumblebees, butterflies, pollinating beetles, solitary bees, solitary wasps, and we've got some very unique pollinators in London as well. We're the only place in the UK where we have Hoplites adjuncta, the Viper's bugos mason bee. London was the first place where a European orchard mason bee arrived. We've got hawksbeard nomad cuckoo bee as well, found in London. It's the only place in the UK where it's known from. There's quite a few bees that are actually unique to London. They're not found anywhere else. London is also has some really good populations of shrill carder bee in the east of the city, on the Thames Gateway, and we've got a really good population of large scabious mining bee, which is a nationally rare bee, around the Olympic Park and in Tower Hamlets Cemetery in Milan Park, and we've also got really good populations of brown-banded carder bee in the eastern part of the city. So, London has some very important pollinators that share the habitat with honeybees. Okay. Going back to honeybees, we've seen a sustained interest in beekeeping in London in the last decade or so, and what you can see here is this chart shows you the sort of rate of hive increases since 2011. We've had a 212% increase, and that's up to 2019, and it's increased since then as well. It's increasing all the time. And speaking to the bee unit and speaking to other people, there's a lot of beekeepers who don't register their hives. So the bee-based data is the best data we've got, but it's not 100% accurate. But conservative estimates are that there's about 7,000 colonies in London. When you include the people who haven't registered their hives, there might be as many as 7,000 colonies in London. That's a lot of bee colonies. Greater London has average hive density of 3 colonies per square kilometre, but there are hotspots in the city, several hotspots in the city where there are densities of exceeding 50 hives per square kilometre. Sorry, my puppy is being annoying. Go and lie down. Go, wait, I'm presenting. So we have some areas of the city where we have very, very high colony densities. And it's these areas that we're most concerned about, because it's these areas where we're seeing lots of notifiable disease outbreaks. We're getting more reports of colonies starving and colony welfare issues. So it's the hotspot areas that are particularly worrying to us in terms of sustainability, or do we have too many bees in an area and in the forage? Okay. So this is a map showing honeybee colonies in London. This is data from 2019 from DEFRA. This is colony registrations per square kilometre. So we can't show you exactly where the hives are located because that would be breaching beekeeping confidentiality. This is the highest resolution we're able to show this data at. So this just shows you the number of hives per square kilometre. Okay. And what you tend to see is the inverse of the forage situation. If you look back to the forage map here, you have more forage, good forage on the outside the city. The city centre tends to have less good forage. If you compare that map with hive density, you have a lot more hives in this towards the city centre than you do in the more suburban areas on the fringe of the city, which is where most of the quality foraging habitat is. And this is very alarming because we've basically put a lot of bees into an area where there is very limited forage. You know, so our concern is that in the centre of the city, beekeeping is not sustainable. Further out in the suburbs, towards the edges of the city, it's probably much more sustainable because there's a lot more habitat to support the colonies. So even though we've got some higher colony densities further out, in terms of being enough food for honeybees, it's probably not such a serious concern. But then if you were to look at the needs of wild bees as well and how all those honeybee hives are competing with wild bees, you know, it's for me, it's a concern. As an ecologist, I find it concerning as well because I have a good understanding of honeybee competition with wild bees. So that's the sort of picture, the forage availability versus the hive distribution. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. I've got a naughty puppy. Come hear you in your crate. So this slide it's showing distribution of colony densities around the city, and the average colony density for Greater London as a whole is 3 hives per square kilometre. Now, in terms of competition with wild bees and things like that, the evidence suggests that the sort of honeybees, from a resource competition perspective, they have an impact on wild pollinators when you get above 3.5 colonies per square kilometre. So if the average for London is 3 colonies per square kilometre, then we're kind of under that threshold where we're having an impact on wild bees and other pollinators. So the good news is that most of Greater London is below that sort of density where it's going to have a detrimental impact on other pollinators. But it's the hotspots where we've got very high hive density. That's the areas that we're concerned about. And there are quite a few squares where we have, you know, well above 3 hives per square kilometre, where we probably are having, I would say almost certainly are having an impact on other pollinators as well. And these are the areas that we really need to be concerned about and need to address, you know, green space and creating more habitat for them and looking at ways we can reduce colony densities in those areas to sort of even things out and try and keep beekeeping at a sustainable level in the city, across the city. So there's those 2 maps again, quality foraging data and registered hive data. Now the Giggle data is now out of date. This data came from things like Parks and Green Space Condition Surveys, which used to be funded by the General London Assembly. They're no longer funded. They haven't been funded since 2009, 2011. And so local authorities no longer have funds to survey all the green spaces properly. So this data is now out of date, but it's still the most accurate data we have. It's the best data we have. No one else has any really good quality data. I'm going to go a bit more into the sort of forage data later on, because I'm going to talk about some other studies and other reports that have been published which use slightly different metrics. So it's again, we see Central London tends to have less forage, but higher densities of hives and hotspots. You know, so London Beekeepers asked the question, how many honeybees is too many? Or, well, you know, and they haven't wanted to kind of put a figure on this because they don't want to alienate beekeepers. But speaking personally as an ecologist and someone who's interested in wild bee conservation, you know, the available data suggests that once you get above 3.5 colonies per square kilometre, that's when you start to have a negative impact on pollinators. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the studies done in other European cities, looking at sustainability of beekeeping in other European cities and some of the data they've supplied, and we'll talk a bit about that later on. So this is one area where there's lots of hotspots in this area where you've got a lot of hives. This particular area is sort of Camberwell Peckham area, which is kind of one of the particularly high density areas. But there are other areas in northwest London, out towards Harrow, where you've got very high densities as well. Okay. So the issues arising from high densities honeybees, we've mentioned about welfare, competition for the pollinators, disease spread, pathogen spread, all this kind of, the social impact as well, more swarming, things like that. But going back, looking at the forage needs of bees, each year a honeybee colony needs to collect between 50 and 100 pounds of pollen and 300 to 500 pounds of nectar, just to meet its own metabolic needs in raising its worker force. So that's just to raise its worker force. That's before it makes a surplus honey for the beekeeper, before they draw new comb and produce wax, before they put aside enough stores for them to survive the winter on, and and all their other, and to fuel all their other activity needs. So if you look at the overall nectar consumption needs of a large honeybee colony on an annual basis, some colonies are collecting up to 100 gallons of nectar a year. If you do the math, it's mind-boggling amounts of forage that they're collecting. And we don't really see this, because we see the honey, as a beekeeper, you see the honey supers filling up, but you don't see all the other things the bees are doing. They're actually burning and consuming, and most of the nectar they bring in, they're not storing it as honey. So this is, again, it's just overview of some of the animal welfare, wildlife conservation concerns. It's shorter forage might lead to weaker colonies, which are there more susceptible to robbing. This spreads disease, and bees might be having to fly longer distances to find food, which means they're expending more energy than they're bringing back in rewards. This can stress out the colonies and make them more susceptible to pathogens, pests, and diseases. Feral colonies is another problem, because they become reservoirs for pathogens and pests like varroa. There's London beekeepers have been very cautious in that there's some evidence that honeybee pathogens might affect wild bees. There's actually a lot of evidence now. Since they've published this report, there's a lot more evidence come out which actually supports that there is a serious threat of pathogen spread to wild bees. A recent paper showed that within a few hundred meters radius of honeybee apiaries, you get significantly higher instances of honeybee viruses in hoverflies and in wild hymenopterans. And again, in this report, they've been quite moderate in saying that there's emerging evidence that honeybees compete with other bees for nectar and pollen. There's actually an awful lot of mounting evidence now, and if you look at the recent stuff that's been published, I'm going to kind of whip through them in a little bit. There's actually a lot of evidence now which is kind of painting a pretty dire picture that honeybees are actually competing with wild pollinators when you exceed this 3.5 colony per square kilometre threshold. And as I've said before, there's also problems with swarming. I've mentioned that before. If a swarm lands on a business front of a shop or in a restaurant, etc., it can cause financial loss to small businesses. It's antisocial. It's also reputational issues for the beekeepers involved as well. So we need to kind of address these issues. So that the sort of conclusion that London beekeepers have came to is that London is not a homogeneous environment when it comes to wildlife. Pollinator forage is very, very, very distributed. The number of colonies in London continues to rise. Colonies are not homogeneous; they're distributed differently as well. In parts of the city, they're concerned that the number of bees is 4 times what the area might be able to sustain in terms of the carrying capacity of the habitat. And we think that in parts of the city, there's the densities of honeybee colonies is detrimental to the well-being of bees and also to wild bees as well. Okay, so the London beekeepers have developed a position in response to this, and their kind of response to their findings is they're trying to promote responsible and sustainable urban beekeeping within a sort of biodiverse London ecosystem, and they're trying to promote better understanding of bees, both among beekeepers and with the public. So they're doing a lot of outreach work and education, trying to upskill and educate people on these issues. They're promoting more accurate and evidence-based narratives for bees in London. So trying to move away from the Save the Bees London and all this kind of stuff, and sponsor beehives and all that stuff, and trying to promote conserving the right pollinators and taking appropriate actions rather than inappropriate actions. Because a lot of the actions that have been taken to save bees have focused on honeybees, and they've been well-meaning but misplaced actions, which have led to inappropriate, negative consequences. And they've got this Bees and Flowers Go Together initiative, which is an initiative to try and improve the London environment for bees. And they've developed a pollinator fund. They launched that a couple of years ago, and they're giving out this small grant. So people can apply for a small grant. You get up to £1,000 to create habitat forage for bees, but it's also to fund wild bee nesting habitats and things as well. It's not just honeybee centric. So they're doing stuff like that. And as I said before, there's lots of benefits to beekeeping. There's a lot of public fascination with bees. People often go on a beekeeping course or go on a beekeeping sort of experience, and that's their introduction to bees. And then from then they might go on to study wild bees and become a wild bee enthusiast. So beekeeping can be a vehicle for increasing public awareness about the natural world, about pollinators more broadly, not just honeybees. Honeybees offer a window into the world of wildlife. You can open a hive, you can pick up from the bees, you can see the bees, you can see the behaviour on the frame. It's a way for people to get up close to an animal, and it can be a really good introduction to pollinators more broadly. London, we don't get huge yields of honey in many parts of the city, but we do get an exceptionally quality honey. We've got our honey that we get in the city is very complex because we have a wide variety of forage. So we do get great honey, and there's lots of personal well-being benefits surrounding beekeeping as well. I work with young people who are neurodiverse, they have behavioural disorders, learning problems, and I use beekeeping as a tool to teach them new life skills, food safety, food hygiene, woodwork skills, caring for the environment, planting, gardening, all these sort of things. There are lots of benefits to beekeeping. It's not all negatives about there being too many hives in London. And the London beekeepers, they've drawn up a guide for responsible urban beekeeping, and these are their sort of guidelines. It's be considerate in the social context towards other beekeepers, wild bees and other wildlife, get good training. Training is paramount. You're only as good as the training you've received. Keep nice bees, so avoid keeping nasty bees that are aggressive and sting people. Keep docile bees to avoid these antisocial issues. Practice good swarm prevention and control, because not practicing swarm control in the city centre is antisocial. Manage bee health. So if you keep your honeybees healthy, there's less pathogen spread to wild bees. So beekeepers have an important role to play in preventing pathogen spread to wild bees by keeping their own bee stocks healthy. So manage bee health, keep your apiary hygiene good, register your hives and ensure your hives. We can only paint a picture what the situation is if we know where registrations are. If people register the hives and we know where hives are distributed, we'll never know exactly where your hives are. The NBU do not give us that level of data. It's always on a 1 square kilometre resolution. So you can register and not worry about your hive locations being disseminated. It's not going to happen. But joining and registering with your local beekeeper association with the National Beekeeper is really, really important. And the other thing we need to do is we need to prepare contingency plans for adversity. So when we get cases of bee disease, etc., we've got a contingency plan in place to deal with it, nip it in the bud before it becomes a spillover problem for other beekeepers and for wild bees. And then the other thing we're doing is we're promoting planting of appropriate flowers. So the association's got loads of information on its website about what people plant for bees and things like that. So I'm just going to flick through that. So that's the end of that. I'm just going to very quickly switch presentations because I've got a couple of other slides I want to talk to you about. Slideshow from the start. Okay, so this was the giggle map. This is where we left off before. So this was the bee unit data. That's that. Okay, we've looked at London beekeepers. So there's been in addition to the London beekeepers, the London Bee Situation Report, there's been a few other papers published looking at how sustainable beekeeping is in London. One of them was Phil Stevenson's report. He works at Royal Botanic Gardens, and he produced a report in 2020 called The State of the World's Urban Ecosystems. What can we learn from trees, fungi, and flower? And what he did is he took the bee units data, the same as we did, and put it on a map. And he looked at the foraging habitat across London, but rather than use the Giggle data, which is now over a decade out of date, he used Landsat imagery instead. Landsat imagery to work out the amount of green space in each 1 kilometre square where there are hives registered, and try and work out the quality of the habitat based on Landsat imagery. And he combined all that information, produced this map, which is a map showing squares where there are hives in London, and it shows you how sustainable they are. And as you can see, in the centre of the city, unsurprisingly, where there's very little forage, but a lot of hives, a lot of high hive density, he's deemed those areas to be unsustainable for beekeeping. So we need to...
we just lost your screen sharing, Mark.
Okay, go to the application. Let me do this again. Right. Right. Okay, back to it. Right. You can see it again? Can you see the screen again?
Perfect.
Okay. So Phil Stevenson's report, what you can see here is you can see where there are hot spots with high hive density and there's not a lot of forage. You can see where, you know, it's deemed unsustainable. And Phil Stevenson, what he did was he looked at the available evidence for, you know, the carrying capacity for honeybees, how much habitat, and I think it's something like seven. Each hive needs something like 7 hectares of habitat to find enough food all year round to feed itself. And based on that green space and the quality of that green space, the habitat in each of those 1 kilometre squares, he worked out that on average, London can support something like 7.5 colonies per square kilometre. But that's only factoring in how much forage is available for honeybees. It doesn't include the needs of wild bees as well. So if we go back to the needs of wild bees, you know, a lot of those pink squares in there that are kind of like, you know, they're sort of a bit unsustainable, but not really, really unsustainable. If you were to factor in the needs of wild pollinators as well, they'll probably be a much deeper red colour. And some of those green squares will probably be paler green as well, because what this report didn't take into consideration was the needs of wild bees. And as I'm going to talk about in a minute, there's lots of evidence that honeybees actually do pose a competition risk to wild bees. And there's been some work done in Germany, which is, you know, looking at what percentage of the forage in a landscape is used up by honeybees. And if you get something like 26 hives per square kilometre, that they're using up all of the available forage, you know, within flying distance of the hive. So this just shows sustainability in terms of honeybee hives, assuming there's nothing else foraging on the habitat as well. Okay, so some of the other works that have support and kind of back up, you know, suggesting that beekeeping in cities like London is becoming unsustainable. As before mentioned, Kew Gardens, Phil Stevenson's report. You can get this online. I think it's on Wiley online. There was a publication in 2021 by Renner et al. Titled High Honeybee Abundance Reduces Wild Bee Abundance on Flowers in the City of Munich. And this report looked at the state of beekeeping in Munich. And there's been quite a lot of studies done in Germany. Some of the German cities have a really high hive density, much higher than London. London has an average hive density of like 3 hives per square kilometre. And in some of the German cities like Berlin, they have hive densities of 16 or 17 hives per square kilometre. That's the average hive density per square kilometre. It's frighteningly high. And a lot of that has been driven by commercial beekeepers bringing beehives into the city in summer to monopolise on the linden tree bloom to get linden honey, because linden honey is a highly sought after honey. It sells for a high price, commands a high price. And what this researcher did is they looked at how honeybee competition in Munich was affecting wild bees, and they found that high densities of honeybees in Munich were affecting wild bee diversity, wild bee abundance in the city gardens. in 2019 and 2020, there was a series of publications by Liza Rapaz and her colleagues, and this looked at the effects of competition between honeybees and native wild pollinators in several different regions of France. Some of them were done in rural France in areas of high floral diversity, where you had seasonal superabundance of flowers from flowering scrub and heathland. And there was also a study done in Paris. And what they found was that Paris has far lower hive density than London. It doesn't have anywhere near the numbers of hives that London has. It's much, much lower than in London. And they have compulsory registration there. You have to register. So the hive data they had there was probably more accurate than what we've got, but it was still sure that there was fewer hives in Paris than there are in London. But what they found in that study of looking at honeybees and wild bees in Paris was that even at the lower, so Paris has a lot more green space, a lot more tree cover, and a lot more habitat than London does, in comparing the two cities in terms of green space and habitat. But it has far fewer hives than what London has. But they still found that in the Paris study that, you know, within 600 meters radius of honeybee apiaries, there was a 50% reduction in wild bee abundance. And the studies that done in other parts, that Liza Rapaz done in other parts of France, has shown that it's had similar results. Show that, you know, within 600 meters of a radius of a honeybee apiary, there's a 50% reduction in wild bee abundance. But in some of her studies, she went on to look at wild bee reproductive success, and they also found that within close proximity to high, you know, apiaries with large numbers of hives, wild bee breeding success was reduced by half as well. And they were able to prove causality. They were measuring the amounts of forage that the honeybees were collecting from the habitat, and they were able to demonstrate that its wild bee abundance and breeding success was reduced by half in response to pollen depletion from all the foraging honeybees. Similarly, there's been several studies done in Switzerland and Swiss cities, and Casanels et al. Produced a report last year titled "Challenging the Sustainability of Urban Beekeeping Using Evidence from Swiss Cities." And in that report, they found very similar outcomes to what we have in London, high hive density, you know, which outstrip the available forage, and, you know, potentially impacts on wild bees as well. And then most recently, just this year, in February this year, Messinas et al. Published a paper called "Declining Wild Bee Species Richness is Associated with Honeybee Abundance in an Urban Ecosystem." And this was a study done in Montreal in Canada. And what they did was, a decade ago, they studied the number of hives in Montreal, and they studied the availability of pollen and nectar on clover, fields of clover in some of the sort of open green spaces in the city. And they measured the amount of pollen and nectar produced by those flowering plants. And they went back 10 years later and repeated the study, and they found a 10-fold increase in hive registrations. They went from, you know, a couple of hundred hives to about 3,000 hives in the city of Montreal in the space of 10 years, 10, 15 years. And they found that there was a significant reduction in the amount, the availability of pollen and nectar in the clover plants. They've actually went around and measured the amount of pollen and nectar in the clover plants, and they did some controls where they caged areas of clover to exclude honeybees, to exclude pollinators, so they could measure what the volumes of pollen and nectar were being produced by the flowers when the bees were excluded. And the ones that, in the control areas, they were producing the same amount of pollen and nectar as they were 10, 15 years ago, but where honeybees were accessing, all these additional honeybees were accessing the clover, it was depleting the pollen and the nectar. And they found that this was having a big impact on wild bee abundance, and several of their bee species they think might have lost regionally in the immediate within the city because of the competition for honeybees. So it's a challenging thing for beekeepers. We're kind of trying, particularly if you're a beekeeping association, we want to promote beekeeping. We want to, you know, maintain the craft of beekeeping, and but it's a difficult pill to swallow. We have to face the reality that our actions are having an impact on wild bees and pollinators. It's not the bees' fault. We mustn't demonize honeybees. The issue is it's us. We've changed the way we keep our bees, you know, and that there's lots of people who will argue that 100 years ago there were a lot more hives than there are now. There's various people who will suggest that, you know, in the 19th century, you know, early 1900s, there were, you know, close to 1 million hives in the UK. But the bees we kept then, the bees we keep now are a completely different animal. We've imported bees from abroad and hybridized them. Our colonies are substantially bigger than the native honeybee colonies we used to keep in straw skeps, you know, 100, 150 years ago. We've lost 98% of our meadows. We've lost lots of our hedges. We've lost lots of our foraging habitat. We've changed the nature of the animal that we keep. The bees we keep now are a completely different animal to the native bees we used to keep 100, 150 years ago. We keep them in these big cavernous wooden boxes now, which are drafty and thermally inefficient, which causes the bees to use up more resources, more energy to maintain the hive nest. And if you compare a native honeybee colony living in a straw skep or in a natural tree cavity to a managed colony, the big modern square beekeeping box, they're consuming between 12 and 20 times the amount of floral resources as the native colonies in a skep or a natural cavity would. So we've changed the animal. And so in a similar way that we've intensified agriculture to increase outputs, we're getting more milk from cows, we're getting more crop yields per hectare of land, etc. We've done the same with our bees. We've changed the nature of the honeybee. And so, you know, the situation we're in now is that, you know, we've got increasing honeybee numbers, but we've got these big sort of hybrid bees and these big cavernous beehives that are consuming more forage. So we kind of need to, I think we need to, as beekeepers, we need to be having a look at how we're actually keeping bees. Maybe we need, you know, we need to keep smaller colonies. We need to keep fewer colonies. If you're an amateur beekeeper, you don't need big, huge colonies. You don't need lots of colonies. If you're doing it as a hobbyist, if you just want a few jars of honey, you don't need to have huge numbers of colonies or have very big colonies. You know, it's more difficult for the bee farmers and things because they're trying to make a living out of producing honey, and they have to have lots of hives to do that. And they're facing a very difficult, challenging time with, you know, material costs, import costs, energy costs going up. Inferior imports, honey imports from abroad often adulterate with sugar syrup and things. So the bee farmers are facing lots of challenges. It's much harder for bee farmers to address issues, but as amateur beekeepers, there's lots we can do. We could be looking at the way we keep our bees, looking at keeping smaller colonies, keeping fewer colonies, following best practice as well to reduce pathogen spillover, and trying to make our beekeeping more sustainable. Okay, so going to, oh yeah, so just on, earlier on I mentioned that there is an estimated 7,000 colonies in London. That's, you know, the 5,000 or so registered colonies plus ones we think aren't registered. If all of those colonies are collecting, you know, huge amounts of nectar, then it's enough each year they're collecting enough nectar to fill a Liverpool pool in Stratford, which is like, so that's just a little picture just to sort of give you a bit of to visualize how much nectar, all the nectar resources, all the beehives in London are actually collecting on an annual basis. So that's the end of my presentation, and we'll take questions if you've got time. I think I might have run over a little bit. I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Okay.